Why lesbians rule the LGBT community. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and people commonly wonder why exactly it is that seemingly the majority of LGBT nonprofits, pride festivals, and similar community-wide organizing tends to be headed primarily by lesbian feminists. From what it would seem, gay men often take back seat when it comes to organizing that is supposed to represent the grand total of the alphabet soup. It's not that there aren't various organizations designed to be specifically for gay men, most commonly having something to do with HIV and AIDS, drug and alcohol addiction counseling, and other such health concerns, because there are a few of them, though often those by no means escape the watchful eye of lesbian feminists. But much more than that, there have been instances like when the Toronto Pride Festival banned the Canadian Association for Equality from their parade due to the fact that they pay specific attention to gender-specific male issues, and they are not feminists. Really, basically everybody with any experience with the rainbow community can tell you that lesbians are in charge of almost everything that isn't a profitable business like a bar or nightclub. They did, after all, change the acronym to make this subtly clear to people, which is why it used to be GLBT, but is now LGBT. Despite what lesbians will probably tell you, and despite the fact that there are numerically a lot more gay men than there are lesbians, at some point, lesbians basically demanded that gay men bend the knee. Why is that? Well, actually, it's fairly simple what probably happened. AIDS happened. But let's back this up a bit. Prior to the AIDS epidemic, which mainly really hit in gay urban meccas during the 1980s, there were a lot of very strong gay male leaders. Harvey Milk was the obvious one that now has his face on a federal stamp, who was such a badass that he ended up being assassinated. We also had Harry Hay, who coined the label of radical fairies, which was basically a gay male quasi-separatist culture that he was a big part of founding and leading after he severed ties with the Communist Party, which he parted ways with due to the fact that he was a homosexual, as communists don't endorse homosexuality. We also had men like John Lauritsen that wrote the essay Dangerous Trends in Feminism, which he delivered as a speech at the Gay Academic Union Conference in 1976, link in the description. Basically, in the essay, he describes much of the exact same bullying, dishonest, and domineering types of behavior that feminists exhibit towards gay men in the current year, but he described it happening in 1976, right before the AIDS epidemic. However, due to the fact that he was confronting the problem at the time, we can assume that other gay men resisted the aggressive feminism that was becoming pervasive at the time. Then, of course, the AIDS epidemic happened, and this part is rather hard for me to talk about accurately because so much history has been lost. Probably over 50% of gay men died during the 1980s and 1990s, and that's a fairly low estimate. And the ones that survived were devastated by the loss of their partners and/or communities. This epidemic was widely ignored by the American public as politicians largely wouldn't acknowledge what was going on, and there are conflicting stories about how exactly feminists handled the AIDS epidemic. On one hand, I have heard accounts from gay men well over 50s that say that the feminist establishment ignored the AIDS crisis because, of course, this was an issue that only affected men. So why would feminist organizers care about the gay triarchy? However, nobody contests the notion that there were, in fact, a number of lesbians that ended up devoting a lot of serious time and energy in what must have been a heartbreaking effort of trying to help the sick and dying in the gay male community, as one after another slowly died as a result of losing their immune systems. Again, nobody denies that there were several lesbians that did really help gay men out. And why wouldn't they? They knew these guys because they lived in the same urban areas, because especially during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, almost every openly homosexual person of either gender lived in big cities. But they might have had to split off from feminist organizing to take care of dudes. Regardless, whether or not lesbians and gay men always got along super well back in the day, the lesbians weren't going to sit around and let guys die while homeless on the street. So they might have said, "up yours," to some of the feminist organizations. I think they probably did. That's what I've heard. I would love to see a historical account of a lesbian defying greater feminism. If anybody can point me in the direction of it, I'd love to look at it. So, when there were a shortage of healthy gay men to do the work, a number of lesbians took care of them and became very involved in charity organizations. However, like all things related to charity organizations, it had the potential to become a business, and that definitely happened in many instances. There were numerous lesbians whose full-time jobs became intertwined with those charity organizations, including pride festivities. One thing I think a lot of people don't understand about the homosexual and transgender demographic is that we did have a necessity to organize things like pride parades, at least certainly once upon a time. When our President of the United States at the time, Ronald Reagan, refused to even say the phrase AIDS for several years, after hundreds of thousands of people had died, pride parades became a way to remind the citizens of our cities that there were many gay people out there, and we refused to be ignored while people were literally dying. So when you keep all of that in mind, you have to remember that a lot of lesbians really did put their sweat and tears into being relatively altruistic for gay men, even though it did become their full-time job in many instances, and eventually might have even gotten a few of them rich. Then, eventually, once gay pride and the GLBT or eventually LGBT community became more of a thing, and it had its own economy by the mid-1990s, powered not just by the community itself, but by generous heterosexual donors that realized that they should help out too with donations, well, eventually, of course, feminism wanted in. By the late 1990s, it became clear through the proliferation of things like queer studies that there were feminists trying to evangelize the entirety of the LGBT community with some sort of intersectionality type stuff. At this moment in history, I don't completely know what went down and have to assume that there's a lot of gray areas around the details. I don't know if there were lesbians that resented feminists for sneakily trying to worm their way into the community that they had taken care of, if they resented the feminist colonization, or if they were slowly enticed back into the fold of feminism, assuming that they had been feminists at some point. It's probably some combination of all of those things in terms of what happened, and I'm sure it really depends upon the individual lesbian. If you talk to these women, I'm sure they all have differing stories. I'm sure some of them are cool, and they're cool old lesbians, and they say that feminists are a bunch of shady opportunists, and there are some crotchety old lesbians that claim feminism has always been kind to the ungrateful gay community. I don't know. It depends on who you ask, I'm sure. Regardless, what I do know from personal experience was that I went to a screening of a documentary film about lesbians one time in the mid 2000s, and it was a room full of about 75 lesbians that were mostly over 40. When it got to the part in the film where an older gay man said, "Gay men will never be able to repay the debt of how much we owe lesbians due to the care they provided during the AIDS crisis." When he said that, half of the women in the room said out loud, "That's right." But here's the thing. This documentary screened in the mid 2000s after medications had already started to really improve the lives of HIV patients and guys were dying less. So at this point, I have to wonder whether each of these women had actually helped out gay men or whether they were just kind of acting like they did to take credit for other people's good deeds. And why am I suspicious? Well, first off, I hate speaking about females in general terms, but one thing I have noticed about women over the course of my life is that if they ever help you out, they'll likely never really let it go. And they often bring it up over and over, reminding you how lucky you are that they helped you. Often, they even exaggerate what they really did. But even more than that, what I find most suspect is this. It's not all that hard to find feminist blog article after feminist blog article, even to this day, going on about the brave and compassionate lesbians that helped out gay men during the AIDS crisis, and feminists always bring this shit up, taking all the credit in the name of feminism. Seriously, you can try talking to a 20-year-old college student female that identifies as non-binary and pansexual, and you can ask her why gay men need feminism, because she undoubtedly feels that we do, and more than half of the time, even a young woman who wasn't even alive during the AIDS crisis will tell you that females earned their place in the gay male community by taking care of dying men, or something. Assuming that we can directly relate that to the dynamics of today, which is majorly pushing it. Really, what I think feminists actually mean when they say that lesbians earn their place in the community or whatever, is that the females that are in charge deserve to stay in charge. These women who are in charge are also, of course, women who were put in charge that were appointed by the previous females that were in charge, who were in charge because all the men died in the 1980s. So here's what I say. If I meet a cool old lesbian that took care of gay men directly, or organized a legitimately helpful charity that did stuff for the gay male community at a time of massive crisis, then yes, she will absolutely have my respect. Not necessarily because she helped me and my community, as I was a small child in the 1980s anyway, but much more so. I would have respect for this woman because she did a good thing, and I can assume she would have valuable insights about how to be a generally decent person. However, one thing I will not do, as an HIV-negative man in my 30s, is to sit back and passively allow younger bisexual, lesbian, pansexual, and non-binary identified women to order me around. I will not let them tell me how to be a gay man and then say that they have the right to order me and my gay male peers around because of something that happened in the 1980s that they weren't even involved with. I think the statute of limitations for how much influence queer women deserve to have over gay men has just about reached its end. And I hope to personally be part of a new generation of gay men that has a stronger sense of self-esteem, autonomy, and dignity in regards to how we deal with our female counterparts. I have no problem with queer females intrinsically. Just don't tell me what to do, and we'll be cool. That's all I have to say for this video. If this spoke to you, please consider donating to me on PayPal or Patreon, link in the description, and stay tuned.